Thank you so much, Roger, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you all for being here today, for making time out of your busy schedules. As I've said earlier in this series, and particularly granted the topic at hand, I can't stress enough that this is a matter of great sensitivity. I talk about it in relatively intense terms, because in my mind, that's the only way to really give it justice, is to not sugarcoat and to really be direct and honest about what all this is about. That if it gets to be too much for you from a sensory or whatever perspective, an emotional perspective, I would invite you to just exercise caution, turn the volume all the way down if you need to, give yourself breaks if needed. Put yourself and your own well-being first, particularly with a matter of this import. So electric shock treatment today in America on people with developmental, I'll add, as well as intellectual disabilities, or as I would say, those of us labeled that way in society. That's our subject for today. Very quickly about my book. It's called A Long Walk Down a Winding Road. The book is kind of a hybrid memoir self-help type book rolled into one. I intend it to be a self-help book first and foremost. Why? Because my mission with this book is really to help people help themselves, based on all that I've learned over the course of my 53-year life as a late identified autistic. But people also like good stories. And so the self-help content is supplemented by a good number of meaningful stories in my life that bring context to the self-help content. And it deals largely with how I feel one can discover greater happiness and success in life in the face of challenge and adversity. Some, hopefully at least one, maybe all of the ideas and insights that I share in the book can be used to carve out a better life. And I focus primarily on strategies for rising above bullying, workplace success, developing social skills, what I call marriaging or being a good spouse, parenting insights, as well as perhaps most importantly, self-esteem building, or as I put it here, learning how to love who you are. So the irony of this topic for me is that I'm not the most avid reader the world has ever seen, but every once in a blue moon, even for me, a book emerges that can really change your perspective on things rather radically. And for me, this book entitled Pain and Shock in America, written by Jan Nisbet, and with contributions by one of our attendees today, Nancy Weiss, was such a book. The publicist for this book reached out to me quite some time ago, asking me to read the book and then perhaps to write about it if I saw fit to do so. And I agreed to do that. And by the time I reached the very first page of this book, I basically said to myself, to write about this, there's no choice here. There's enough gravity and seriousness in this that I feel I have no choice but to write about this if I can truly call myself a neurodiversity community self-advocate. It was that powerful from the outset. And so it's my great honor to introduce to you all a special guest who I have with me today. Her name's Nancy Weiss. I've asked her to speak for 5, maybe upwards to 10 minutes on her perspective on this topic. She made some very key contributions to the book, and many comments that she's made on this matter have been mentioned in articles at some very high-profile media outlets. I believe one among them is CNN, others. She's a leading advocate in this field. So my pleasure to introduce to all of you Nancy Weiss for a couple of relevant comments. Take it away, Nancy.
Thank you so much. I first want to ask if this fan behind me bothers anybody. When I look in the mirror, I think that's very distracting. I mean, when I look at myself in the, so would just unmute yourself and tell me if you'd like me to turn it off. I'm in Mexico and it's hot, so I have the fan on. If it doesn't bother anybody, I'll leave it on, but if it bothers anybody, I'm happy to turn it off. Okay. I first got involved in this issue when I was asked to go to the Judge Rotenberg Center before it was named that. It was originally called the Behavior Research Institute. It was in Providence, Rhode Island. Eventually they moved to Canton, Massachusetts because the regulations in Rhode Island got to be too difficult for them to try to adhere to. And so they moved and they changed the name to the Judge Rotenberg Center. They named it after the judge who was approving everything and anything they wanted to do. I visited there for a couple of days in 1993. It's really the only time I've been there, but I left there personally changed and certain that I needed to do something about this place. I left there. We had just spent a couple of days. I saw there, this was before they developed the electric shock device. They have since developed and manufactured there, had electrical engineers design this device that people carry in a backpack and that gives them incredibly painful, fall on the floor, screaming in agony level electric shocks. They used to say it's like a hard pinch, or I once heard the founder of the facility say it was like when you take your sweater over your head in the winter, which of course people from Florida or Mexico are like, what, taking your sweater over your head, what? But it's nothing like either of those things. And eventually a small piece of video became available that helped us to convey to the rest of the world that it was nothing like a hard pinch or taking your sweater over your head. I saw when I went in 1993, people being sprayed with water, people being pinched, a young girl who had a helmet put over her head and she was strapped down hands and feet. And this helmet came across her chest like a welding helmet. It had a window, in front of her eyes, but that was painted black. It had white noise blaring in her ears and water rhythmically pulsing into her face. She was only 7 or 8 years old. I was in the room when she was hauled off for this punishment. And I said, I worked with people who had challenging kinds of behavioral issues. What did she do? I didn't see her do anything. Well, she made an unnecessary noise. Whatever it wasn't enough to even be conscious. For me, I didn't even hear what she did. I left there after a horrendous couple of days thinking, okay, that was a couple of days. There are people that spend their whole lives there. I need to do something about it. So I wrote an article about the use of painful procedures to try to control people's behaviors. And Amnesty International, like the first thing I thought of was, where's Amnesty International? This is torture. That's the group that does torture stuff. Where are they in this? So I wrote this paper and I called Amnesty International. They were having their national conference in Boston that year. So I said, I want to speak at your conference about this place I just went to. And I told the guy about what I had seen. And he said, oh yeah. He said, what is this a school for juvenile delinquents? I said, no, it's ostensibly a center for people with disabilities. And he said, yeah, yeah, we don't get involved in that. Well, no, you don't, but why? Yeah, because we don't know what people like that need. Oh, well, and I don't think, he said, we're not doctors. Yeah, but I don't know that you need to have any letters after your name to know. I mean, I thought that's what Amnesty advocated for, was humane treatment of everybody. So apparently not, because over the ensuing 40 years, I've tried to get Amnesty involved in trying to advocate against this place. But people have been advocating against it. I've been advocating for 40 years. People have been advocating against it longer than me. It really didn't change until a woman named Jennifer Masumba, who was herself a person who's autistic, who was there as a resident. She wrote me a letter in 2013 and said, I want my story to be told. And her wanting her story to get out. And then we talked about how we were going to get her story out. I sent her letter on her behalf, with her permission, of course, to the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and the Department of Justice. And it wasn't, and now I'd been in touch with the Food and Drug Administration for years, and the Department of Justice, and every other federal agency that I thought might do something. It wasn't until they read it in her words, and that's really how the book opens, with her story. Did it mean anything to them? Did it touch them in a way that other advocates couldn't touch them? So since then, the FDA banned the use of electric shock for behavior control. The Judge Rotenberg Center challenged that in court and won. However, literally just in the past few days, we were able to get Congress to put into the omnibus bill, which is the bill that they pass every year to refund all the federal agencies, a little tiny thing. In fact, a reporter just said to me, I looked through the whole omnibus bill. I can't find what you're talking about, but there's just a couple of sentences in there that gives the FDA the right to ban these electric shock devices. So a little bit of progress there, but it's been a long time. And when people hear about the fact that they use electric shock there, at one point, the United Nations said it's torture. It wouldn't be legal against even convicted terrorists, but yet we use it against people who have very few rights or autonomy or ability to protect themselves. The United Nations called upon the United States to close the place down and take action, but that never happened. When people hear about what goes on there, they all ask the same question, which is, how could that be legal? Wait, we do that to people with disabilities now? We're not talking about the 1930s. We're not talking about what happens in some third world country. We're talking about Massachusetts, which has a reputation as being a very progressive state. So Jan Nisbet and I wrote the book in hopes of answering that question. How is it still going on? Jan really started writing the book probably 20 years ago. She then worked on it for a while, then she put it aside for 15 years while she had a different kind of job. And I kept saying to her over that 15 years, are you ever going to finish that book, Jan? And eventually she said, you know what, Nancy, I don't think I'm ever going to finish that book. Maybe you'll finish it for me. So that's how she and I came to write this book together. She wrote the first 10 chapters. I wrote the last 2 chapters. And the book tries to tell the story of how, in a country that would want to present itself as being a fair and humane place, we still do horrible things to people who are disenfranchised.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for sharing your perspective there. I will kind of pick up from there, and we'll be reiterating some of your points. So the Judge Rotenberg Center is literally only 2 towns away from where I live in Massachusetts. Knowing what goes on there and my proximity to it is a source of great emotional unease for me. It's something I haven't been able to stop ruminating over for quite some time now. As Nancy had mentioned, The school uses electric shocks with the goal of trying to inhibit or eliminate behaviors that the school considers to be toxic or inappropriate. And a key point to be made here is that over the course of the history of the Judge Rotenberg Center, going back to when it was known as the Behavioral Research Institute before being renamed, it's this notion that you start out with certain types of aversive behavioral interventions. Eventually, they start to fall short in terms of individuals not responding the same way to them, becoming desensitized to them. And then as a result of that, a new, more potent intervention starts to be used, and on and on and on, and it becomes just a disastrous domino effect, where you see over the history of this institution an evolution in the use of aversive behavioral interventions, starting out, in addition to what Nancy had alluded to, with things like withholding meals, ammonia sprays in the face, spankings, leading to the first or older electric shock devices, leading ultimately to the fourth generation GED device, graduated electronic decelerators. These are the devices that the omnibus bill has laid a pathway for the FDA to hopefully ban these devices very soon. And it ends up being more of a means of behavioral suppression rather than remediation. Very important distinction to be made here. As Nancy had mentioned, the FDA banned the use of GEDs in 2020, several years after first finding out about this issue. In Jennifer Musumba's letter sent to the FDA, if I have this right, Nancy, it was about a 7-year differential between when they first found out about it from Jennifer's letter to the 2020 ban, arguing that these devices pose too great a risk of illness or injury, only for the DC Circuit Court of Appeals to overturn the ban the next year in response to the Judge Rotenberg Center's very high-powered lawyers arguing for their reinstatement. It was a 2-to-1 decision on a 3-judge panel, 2-to-1, that led to these devices being reintroduced, arguing the FDA under federal law is prohibited from interfering in the practice of medicine, which is left up to doctors and other healthcare practitioners. The irony of this being that the Judge Rotenberg Educational Center is considered to be a school. These aren't MDs administering these devices. This is the Judge Rotenberg Educational Center, many of the people of whom are hired without sufficient training on how to best take into account the wants and needs of the students there, is the irony here. They're equating it on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals with the practice of medicine. I don't think so. So this is what really gets under my skin. If you consider the milliamps of what an effective stun gun is rated at, and I went to an actual ARMS website to dig up these numbers, it's anywhere from 3 to 4.9 milliamps in a stun gun. The first generation GED device, the GED-1, which, as Nancy mentioned, was designed by the JRC in tandem with relevant engineers started out at 13 milliamps. You go up to today's GED-4, in force now for a number of years, and that doubles to 26 milliamps. The numbers tell the story here. Absolutely, this is more than just a pinch or a sensation of when a sweater or a sweatshirt is lifted over your head. 26 milliamps with a stun gun at 3 to 4.9 gives you some perspective. The justifications that the JRC gives, they say this is a last resort, a last-ditch resort at reducing extreme self-injurious behaviors, which are behaviors that at times could be used on others. They claim that by mitigating these kinds of behaviors, that they are saving lives based on this notion that these self-injurious behaviors could be intense enough that the student might kill him or herself. We're saving lives. We're making it so that our students can learn essential skills for living better lives, to eliminate the need for psychotropic medications, to eliminate the need for mechanical restraints. There's a typo, I said restaurants there. Really, that should be restraints. But these are claims that have been publicly made, that are mentioned in Pain and Shock in America, as well as in the article that I've written on this subject. But at what cost? If these are the objectives, and the objectives I can understand, but at what cost? As I said earlier, a number of people working at the center were observed as being unqualified to do the work, lack of sufficient oversight, whether by the government or by the higher management at the school. In the absence of sufficient oversight, abuses happen. Now, Jennifer Musumba, the young woman who Nancy mentioned earlier, and whose letter to the FDA was on that first page, that convinced me to pursue this issue further, has the same diagnosis that I have, that of Asperger's syndrome. Asperger's is no longer a valid diagnosis. The DSM-5 diagnostic manual did away with it. But at the time that Jennifer and I were diagnosed, the GED-4 was or the DSM-4 was enforced. And in the DSM-4, excuse me, Asperger's is a valid diagnosis. And as an ASPE, self-injurious behaviors is by no means something I struggle with. Granted, there are no two people on the autism spectrum who are exactly alike. But the bottom line is that for a number of people who are autistic with other developmental intellectual disabilities, when you lack sufficient oversight, it's easy for devices to be abused and to be used when they should not be, for far less than criminal behaviors. Jennifer mentions in her letter to the FDA about being shocked while asleep. for loud disruptive talking, for doing relatively harmless things without permission, for not following an instruction. For example, getting out of a chair when not given permission to do so, maybe to go to the bathroom or for some other need, or for remaining seated when told to get out of the chair, but just maybe not ready to get up. Harmless things that would often lead to electric shocks. In the absence of legitimate oversight, that's where abuse sets in. So how is this allowed to continue, and shockingly legally? Well, you've got some very high-powered lawyers hired by the Judge Rotenberg Center to represent them. Oftentimes, they would play the victim card, saying, we've been targeted by people who are biased, who are out for vengeance, who are out to shut down the institution, to send these students away, who we feel are best served under our roof. Whatever other arguments they've made, but those are among them. Very interesting, and in a way shockingly, at least relevant to how my parents brought me up, you had a number of very, very passionate, vocal parents of students at the JRC defending their practices, many of whom signed off in writing on the behavioral plans of their own kids to consent to these electric shocks under extreme circumstances. And as Nancy alluded to earlier, the probate and family court system on which Judge Rotenberg himself served, I believe right up to the time when he passed away, and in whose name the Judge Rotenberg Center was renamed. And when you have ongoing disagreements within and between the legal community, government, professional organizations over the extent of the harm actually inflicted by the electric shock devices, in the midst of all these disagreements, you don't see the kind of decisive action that could put an end to this, and arguably was a kind of climate which the JRC arguably exploited as a justification for continuing to do what they were doing. And you have all kinds of anti-aversive efforts that fell short in the midst of this climate, in the midst of the JRC having the kind of legal team that they did, and I believe still have today. Medical malpractice, civil suits, extensive media coverage. I believe Oprah Winfrey weighed in on this issue. The involvement of the United Nations, calling it torture, human rights organizations weighing in, all kinds of government investigations, many of which were launched, appropriately so, in the state of Massachusetts by virtue of our record overall on human rights and on decency and being the kind of state that we are. Government entities in Massachusetts certainly invested a great amount of time, a great amount of effort over years of trying to shut this place down, but to no avail. Regulations, legislation, and ongoing activism on the part of the advocacy community, of which Nancy and I and many, many, many others are actively involved. All of that, but for naught until perhaps now. And so I say this to kind of be a positive update, but kind of. And I'll make my point here. This $1.5 trillion omnibus appropriations bill passed late last year, which Nancy had mentioned, is a bill in which Congress established a pathway for the FDA to ban the use of electric shock devices. Now it's up to the FDA to take action yet again. But when this pathway was implemented, did Congress consider or even know that it took a good 7 or so years from when they first heard about it to when they implemented the 2020 ban, that it took all these years? Why did Congress delegate this issue to the FDA versus just putting an end to it themselves? I called actually the offices of 2 congressmen. The first one I called was the office of who I thought was my congressman, only to learn that I got redistricted out of that district and got sent elsewhere without even being notified. So that was my second call to my new representative, Stephen Lynch, here in Massachusetts. I called both of our senators, former presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren, who we're happy to have, as well as Ed Markey. I actually heard from Ed Markey's office maybe just an hour and a half before today's event started, for them to tell me, well, you called the Massachusetts office, and policy concerns like the one you have are best handled by our Washington, D.C. office. So when I get the time, I'll be reaching out to them, wanting to know, why not Congress? Why did you kick the can down the road to the FDA? I'm on a fact-finding mission. More on this later. I plan to write a follow-up piece on this after I'm able to learn more. If you want to go to my website and sign up for my mailing list, if you haven't already done so, I invite you to. Everybody on my mailing list are the first to hear about newly published articles and author talks, etc. So more on this later. And if you're interested, I'll be filling people in after I'm able to learn more. So yeah, I mean, a step in the right direction. I'll certainly grant Congress that. But in my mind as an autistic, really only a half measure, in my view. So what are the relevant issues here? This is loaded. Nancy touched on a few of them. I've identified a few more. The end does not always justify the means. Okay, so I am all for saving lives. I'm all for trying to do something to curb self-injurious behaviors and behaviors certainly that may be harmful to others. I am all for the notion of getting somebody off the use of psychotropic medications, etc., etc. I'm okay with the ends, but the ends cannot possibly always justify the means. We as a society seem to have this obsession with punishment, and oftentimes punishment when it's not appropriate. Many in the neurodiversity community, in the autism community, including me, feel as though we are stigmatized and pathologized simply for being different, for being in what I've referred to and others have referred to as being the neuro minority. Do we deserve this kind of punishment? What goes on at the Judge Rotenberg Center to this day could have happened to me had it not been for my parents being thoughtful in their decisions of where to send me during my formative years, was when I was in a more vulnerable state than I am now. And what does this have to do? What does this have to say about the work that me and a multitude of other advocates are doing in working towards acceptance of autism and of neurodiversity? As long as the JRC continues to do what they're doing, we cannot, as a society, legitimately say that we accept neurodiversity. We fight for it. Arguably, it's an uphill battle. A couple of sessions ago, when I talked about workplace neurodiversity and my CALE framework, one of the two A's in the CALE framework that I proposed is acceptance, a necessary ingredient for workplace neurodiversity, which more and more people are arguing is good for the business, good for the bottom line, and arguably a framework just for society in general, not just at the workplace, but society in general. But we can't say that we accept autism and neurodiversity, in my view, until the problem of the JRC is resolved. Not prison inmates, not prisoners of war, death row inmates, not them, but us. I mean, it's unjustifiable. You're just not able to justify that. A society should be judged not only according to how it treats its most vulnerable citizens, but in my view, also according to how it responds when evidence surfaces of abuses leveled on the vulnerable. And there is plenty of evidence that surfaced many years ago. Anderson Cooper covered it on CNN, and I have a link to that footage and his follow-up interview with a JRC official mentioned in my article. And lastly, what about empathy? The final pillar in my CALE framework mentioned 2 author talks ago. E for empathy. When did anybody at the JRC even bother to put themselves in the shoes of those they were doing this to? How would they feel if they were being electric shocked for behaviors that arguably may have been beyond the student's control? Maybe it was a form of stimming, of coping with sensory overwhelm. Maybe, as is the case with me, where I take medication for a tic disorder, maybe these are tics that are very, very difficult, if not impossible, to control. How would they feel if this were being done to them? The problem of empathy. So many problems in our world would be solved if we as a society could simply exercise greater empathy. So for more information, there's my website. There's the article that I self-published in Medium. The link is here. As I've mentioned before, if any of you want a PDF copy of this slide deck, just reach out to me on my contact page at samfarmerauthor.com. Drop me a note. I'll be more than happy to send you a PDF of this presentation. And last, but certainly not least, the book that Jan Nisbet and Nancy Weiss collaborated on, Pain and Shock in America, the book that really just fundamentally changed my outlook immediately as a neurodiversity community self-advocate. The kind of book that you just cannot put down. Certainly by no means an easy read, because if it were, it wouldn't, in my mind, be doing the topic justice. This is a critically important and very provocative and worthwhile read. I encourage you to pick up a copy of this book if you want to learn more about the history of all this, including Nancy's writing and that of Jan Nisbet, both of whom, by the way, are on my mailing list. I'm delighted to say, to have them. And that's all he wrote, so to speak.